Hi, I'm Melanie Ann Phillips, co-creator of the Dramatica theory of story. And in this episode of Beyond Dramatica, we're going to have the third installment in our mini-series, Secrets of the Quad. Well, in our first two installments, we talked about the Dramatica chart and how that represented a quad. 4 items, 4 towers, and each one has certain relationships. These relationships are described and inferred by the structure of the quad itself, which is simply this way. And we said that you could find mass and energy, space and time, or the internal equivalents of knowledge, thought, ability, and desire inside. In the Dramatica chart that we just saw, it's universe, physics, mind, and psychology. And also, we can even look at our reason, our emotion, our logic, and our feelings as fitting into this chart, and all having the same relationships among one another. So what does that show us? That this isn't just a simple placeholder or some cubby holes in which to put items. These items that go in there have to have certain relationships, and each place in the quad has a relationship. Later on, we're going to find out how that relationship actually represents equations of the mind, and we'll go specifically into those, what they mean, how they transmute or iterate, and how to apply them both to stories and psychology. But we're still in the process of getting a feel for the quad so that we have that as a basis by which to then build our understanding. To give you another example now in installment 3 here, that will really kind of bring home that feeling even one more time and hopefully a little more clearly, let's look at the metaphysical elements of history: earth and water and fire and air. Earth, water, fire, and air. Well, these have exactly the same relationships as mass and energy and space and time. Earth and water are relatively unchanging. Now, the earth can have earthquakes, but it's going to be there. And water can rise and fall with the tide or go down a river or rain, but it doesn't really disappear. It just becomes part of the atmosphere. Fire, on the other hand, is something that is a lot more transient. It's something that's more of an activity or a process, more energetic, as it were. And air is basically invisible, even though the wind blows and even though we have to breathe it. When you look at these relationships, it's very much like looking at mass and energy and space and time. Out of all of these, earth, wind, and fire, sort of like the musical group, the reason those go together is they all seem like they're kind of the same thing. Here's earth, here's wind, here's fire, but air is invisible. Air you only notice when the wind blows or when you move your hand really fast and can feel it. It's not as obvious as these, which are readily apparent. Similarly, mass, energy, and space have exactly the same relationships as earth and water and fire, but those three are a lot easier to see or to note, whereas time, that's the ethereal one. So one of the things we're adding to our feel for the quad is, in the lower left-hand corner, there's always going to be something that's a little bit out of left field. It's which of these things is not like the others? It's a family, and they all belong together, clearly, mass, energy, space, time, or earth, wind, fire, and air, but one of them seems a little different. And why? Because each quad is actually, sort of like in calculus, looking at a spiral, going up like this and up like that. A quad represents one time around the spiral, or basically a complete circuit around trigonometry, go all the way around. When you do this, in trigonometry, you're looking at it as a flat plane and saying 360 degrees is the same as 720 degrees and so on. But what's really happening in mental relativity, which is the science of psychology behind Dramatica, is that we're actually in a spiral and we move around to the same position above where we started, but we've also gained in height. And when we've gained in height, we tend to group things psychologically in families by sweeping that extra height difference under the carpet of the first 3 items, so that we look at them as we progress through them, 1, 2, 3, 4, we look at them as being at the same level, but by the time we get to the 4th one to put in that 4th item, we have to take all of that extra shifting in the vertical axis that we've done psychologically, or, so to speak, moving towards the next level by going through a quad through 3 items. On the 4th item, we then are going to jump up to the next level and go through that quad, creating an ongoing helix all the way up to the top until we're dealing with this family. That's the way some mental processes work. Other mental processes work going sideways, by going through these four, and then these four, and then these four, and these four, and then going up to the next one, and going through those four, and those four, and those four, and then up to the next one, and these four, and then up to the next one at the top, which finishes it off. That's a lateral form, and there's also a vertical form. Way too complex to explain at the moment, but we'll be getting into the specific math of that and the specific relationships in a future installment. But for now, to continue to get the feel for the quad, we can see that all of that upward shifting has been ignored in the first three items: earth and fire and water. They go together, mass and space and energy, or even inside in the eternal dimensions of knowledge and thought and ability. But by the time we get down to desire, that's a little wanky. That's the one that's a little bit out of place. So that's another thing we have to have, and the feeling of our quad is that it's really a cycle, and that cycle continues round and around the spiral. Imagine if you take a slinky and you look at it from the end, it's a circle. If you stretch it out and look at it from the side, it appears to be a sine wave. But if you look at it at a 3/4 angle, then you can see that it's really a spiral or a helix moving, in this case, through psychological space-time, as it were, within the construct of this model. Through this model, we have many spirals moving, and these are the processes of the mind spiraling around as they come into play in conjunction with other processes. Well, that's a mouthful there. Let's look to story as something a little more simple, so we can understand. When we look at story, a quad of story, we can see that stories basically are dealing with how we can look at our world, how we can look at ourselves, the choices that we can make, and the contexts in which those choices are not valid. Because every valid course of action, choosing the right thing to do or the right attitude to have, is context dependent. It depends on the situation. Stealing a loaf of bread is generally considered ethically wrong. Stealing a loaf of bread when you need it for your child to survive, and you can't afford it, and no one will give any to you, and somebody's hoarding bread that belongs to them, but they could be giving it to people, and it won't hurt any of the people to take it. It'll only remove some from the supply of the guy who has it. Ethically, stealing the bread is the right thing to do. So you can't say stealing is wrong always. Stealing from a bad person who owns something that they're going to be using to destroy other people's lives, stealing a bomb from a terrorist before they can put it off, that's a bad thing? No, it's all context dependent. And so one quad we could make for story would be our world, exploring ourselves, how we should make choices, and why those choices are context dependent. Another way we could look at stories would be to deal with author and audience. For example, over here we could say we have author, A-U-T, audience, A-U-D, and then we have our message in our story, and over here we have our meaning, M-E-A-N. A little hard to see. Author, audience, message, and meaning. Alright, author is going to appear to be fixed, just like we've seen in the other examples we had, just like our world that we explore is fixed. Audience is going to be fixed. They're coming with their own attitude, their own points of view. The message is what we're trying to get across, and that's going to evolve over the course of the story being laid out for them. And the meaning, as this message is evolving, is constantly changing until we eventually arrive at a meaning. This forms a line. Message and meaning work hand in hand, like space and time, like ability and desire. Audience and author have a relationship more like fixed items, like mass and energy, for example, or like knowledge and thought. Okay, the author knows what the story is about. The audience is trying to figure it out. The same relationships exist again, and the same transmutations can take place. Similarly, we might take two of these same items and create another quad. Author up here, and audience down here. But instead of message over here, how about structure, and how about content down here? that has exactly the same relationships, which is the point of these talks we're having, is to get a feel for what the quad means, not the specific items in it. Author and audience remain the same as they were here, but now we've replaced structure and content. Structure is what stands between the author and the audience. It's the carrier wave through which content is delivered. As the structure is built, it becomes able to hold more and more content of greater and greater detail over the evolution of the telling of the story. And the content is perpetually added, continually added, to each new bit of structure to connect it to the real world. It's through structure and content that we're able to deliver a message that has meaning. But here's the interesting part of having a feeling for a quad. How can we have two quads that both have author and audience in them? It's because the spiral moves in both directions. When I talked about things spiraling up, well, they also spiral down. And interestingly, if you go 4 levels down, then you have one thing that's above another thing, that's above another thing, that's above another thing, and what you get is a sideways quad. 4 items that could be then repositioned like that, instead of like this. There's a big tie-in between the way this crystalline form looks and the way this helix form looks, and DNA. DNA also has a crystalline form when seen under X-rays. That was discovered first before they figured out the double helix. And the helical form of DNA obviously is made up of the bases. And strangely enough, or perhaps not so strangely, DNA has 4 bases that make up each chain. Just 4. Just like knowledge, thought, ability, and desire are the 4 bases of mental relativity. And mass and energy, space, and time are the 4 bases of relativity in the outer world, general relativity. So, if we look at a quad then as having this meaning, we can see that every quad hides spirals within it. Not only do we move around and have to know we're elevating to the next level, but once we've gone through 4 levels, we can look at them sideways or 90 degrees to the path we just took and find that those items will create a quad moving sideways out. The best way to look at these spirals, and I'll do this with my hands because it's hard to draw, is because we have 4 dimensions of mind and 4 dimensions of universe, we can look at one to see the other. So we can look at a 3-dimensional object, and we can rotate it through 4 spaces. That uses up 7 of those placeholders of the inner 4 dimensions and the outer 4 dimensions, because we have to stand on one and pretend it's not changing in order to look at the others. So, in doing this, I have to push my cat back a little bit here. Wait, Clarice. In doing this, if we have a single spiral that moves around, and we take that spiral that's moving out, and then we spiral the spiral so that it does that. And then we take that and we twist that around into a spiral, and then we take that whole thing and twist it into another spiral. You end up with 4 iterations of the spiral, each one twisting in 3 dimensions. That uses up 7 placeholders. The human mind has a memory, short-term memory capacity of about 7 items, plus or minus 2, which is a statistical variation. 7 items. That's why there are 7 numbers in a phone number before you put on the area code. It's the largest number that human beings are set up to remember in short-term memory. Why? Because in short-term memory we've got 8 placeholders with those 8 dimensions. One of them we're going to use to stand on or put our consciousness into to use from that point to look at the others and fill a variable into the others. 4 outside and 3 more inside when we're doing this. Or if we stand on the outside and imagine that we're looking at things in terms of universe or physics, mind, psychology, in terms of mass or energy, space, or time, then we can look at the 4 internal ones, pretending they're not being changed by observing ourselves. As we know, everything that the observer observes is changed by the observer. When we observe ourselves, we're changing ourselves in the process of observation. But in the end, we end up with these quads that go sideways and quads that go upwards, laterally and vertically, and all of that and more makes its way into the Dramatica chart. Not in the names of the items, which everybody looks at, or the handy way we've got them, but in the fact that every quad and every quad within quad represents the objectified processes of the mind and how they interact, inferred and indicated by their position in the quad and the relationship of that quad to the other quads. That's all the time we have for this installment. I'll bring you the next one in just a little bit. Till then, visit us at storymind.com or for Dramatica at dramaticapedia.com.